The desert wind carried more than dust that morning. It carried the smell of cordite, burnt oil, and something older, fear mixed with pride, the scent of soldiers who had already seen too much. On the horizon, tanks lay burning in twisted shapes that looked almost human. Over them, an American flag fluttered above a battered field tent, the insignia of the 1st Infantry Division stenciled in black against the canvas. Inside, maps were spread across folding tables, and a short, broad-shouldered man with a cigarette between his fingers leaned over them, tracing lines with the tip of a pencil. His voice was calm but sharp, the tone of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for chaos. This was Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, commander of the Big Red One, America's oldest and most battle-tested infantry division. To his men, he was more than a general. He was a presence. They called him Terrible Terry, half in jest and half in awe. He was rough, loud, sometimes insubordinate, but he understood soldiers. He had grown from their world, not above it. He could curse like a private, fight like a sergeant, and command like a general. Few officers could balance all three. Terry Allen's story didn't begin in the desert, though. It began far from war, in a quiet corner of Texas in 1888. His father, Colonel Samuel Allen, was a career officer in the U.S. Army, a stern man who believed discipline was oxygen. Terry grew up in the rhythm of bugle calls, surrounded by uniforms, horses, and maps. He learned early that the Army wasn't just a job. It was a life that demanded everything and returned little except pride. But young Allen wasn't the model cadet his father hoped for. At West Point, he was clever, athletic, and rebellious. Rules seemed made to test him. He excelled in tactics but ignored protocol, found comfort in mischief, and failed courses that bored him. The academy expelled him twice before he finally earned a commission through the artillery branch. What others saw as lack of discipline, Allen called independence. He didn't worship authority. He worshipped competence. When the First World War erupted, Allen's restless energy found its purpose. In France, he discovered the battlefield was the only classroom that made sense to him. He learned quickly that combat wasn't about perfect formations or shiny boots. It was about movement, timing, and understanding men under fire. He watched how panic spread and how courage could be contagious. He saw how soldiers responded to officers who shared their danger instead of commanding it from a mile away. He was wounded twice and decorated for bravery. By the war's end, he was convinced that leadership couldn't be taught in manuals. It was earned in mud and blood. The Army, however, was slow to change. Between the wars, Allen drifted through routine posts, frustrated by bureaucracy. Promotions came slowly, reserved for men who fit the mold better than he did. But he never gave up. He studied new tactics, read about mobile warfare, and kept his mind sharp for a war he believed would come again. When it did, in 1939, Allen was ready. He was older now, with gray creeping into his hair, but he still carried the fire of a young officer. In 1940, as America prepared for possible conflict, he was given command of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Field Artillery. His leadership stood out immediately, direct, personal, and often unorthodox. He walked the lines, spoke to privates by name, and expected his officers to fight beside their men, not behind them. Soldiers who served under him said Allen didn't just lead, he inspired. In 1942, he was chosen to command the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. It was a unit with history stretching back to the trenches of France, but its ranks were filled with draftees and young officers who had never seen combat. Allen's task was to forge them into warriors. Training was relentless. He made them march until their feet bled, shoot until their fingers blistered, dig until their backs ached. But he also taught them why it mattered. "You're going to fight men who think they're better than you," he said once during a night drill. "Prove them wrong before they ever see your face." By November 1942, the division was on ships bound for North Africa. Operation Torch was the first major American offensive of the war. For most of the soldiers, it was their first time leaving home. For Allen, it was his test. The landings near Oran were chaotic. Surf too high, equipment lost, confusion everywhere. But Allen moved through the mess with calm precision. He directed beach traffic himself, barked orders through the roar of engines, and when the first German shells began to fall, he was already coordinating the push inland. The Germans had fought here before. They were veterans of desert warfare, confident and efficient. Allen's men were green. Their rifles jammed from sand, Their vehicles overheated and their first encounters with enemy armor were disasters. At Kasserine Pass, the Americans were thrown back in confusion. For a moment, it looked like the campaign might end in humiliation. But Allen refused to let failure define them. He reorganized his lines, pulled shattered units together, and forced his officers to relearn what combat meant. He walked among the soldiers during the night, speaking softly, reminding them they were still the big red one. He didn't punish failure. He replaced fear with purpose. Within days, the division was back in motion. At Guettar, they met the Germans head-on. The battle began before sunrise on March 23, 1943. The ground trembled as panzers advanced across the valley, their silhouettes barely visible through the dust. American artillery opened fire, hundreds of guns shaking the earth. Allen stood on a ridge beside his staff, watching the tanks approach. When a nervous lieutenant suggested they pull back, Allen simply said, "Hold your ground. They'll break before we do." The fight lasted hours. German armor pressed hard, but the 1st Division's gunners found their range. Anti-tank shells ripped through steel. Infantry held their lines with grim resolve. When the smoke cleared, more than 50 German tanks lay burning. The Americans had held. Guettar was a turning point, not just for the campaign but for the U.S. Army itself. For the first time, American troops had defeated the feared Afrika Korps in open battle. Word spread quickly through the desert. The Germans began referring to Allen's men as devils in helmets. To the Americans, he became something mythic. Reporters wrote about the wild Texas general who never polished his boots, who cursed and laughed under fire, who refused to sleep until every man was accounted for. His soldiers adored him. They painted his sayings on their helmets and bragged that they'd follow him through hell. Allen's leadership was unlike anything in the modern army. He believed in trust over fear. He gave his men freedom to act, expecting initiative instead of blind obedience. If a sergeant made the right call in the heat of battle, Allen backed him, even if it meant bending regulations. He despised rigid hierarchy. "War doesn't wait for permission," he often said. Neither should you. But that same independence created tension with higher command. Eisenhower respected his results but disliked his methods. Omar Bradley admired his courage but doubted his discipline. Allen's division sometimes appeared too loose for the Army's taste. Uniforms unbuttoned, salutes ignored, formations sloppy. To the brass it looked like anarchy. To the men it looked like trust. After Guettar, the division continued its advance. The campaign in Tunisia was a brutal grind of heat, dust, and attrition. Allen's men fought through mountain passes, across minefields, and into villages shattered by artillery. He was everywhere, riding in a jeep with dust on his face, ducking under machine gun fire, shouting encouragement until his voice went hoarse. When medics struggled to evacuate the wounded, Allen joined them, carrying stretchers himself. His presence in danger gave courage to others. By May 1943, Axis resistance in North Africa collapsed. The Big Red One had earned its legend. 40,000 prisoners were taken. Entire German battalions surrendered. In Washington, newspapers printed Allen's name beside words like hero and fighter's general. Yet beneath the praise, murmurs of disapproval grew louder. Eisenhower's staff worried that Allen's relaxed discipline would spread bad habits through the Army. Bradley thought he was too close to his men, too informal, too unpredictable. Allen's defenders countered that no one got results like he did. His division was undefeated, its morale unmatched. But in the politics of command, victory wasn't always enough. Still, Allen didn't slow down. The next target was Sicily. His men re-equipped, trained again, and boarded ships for another invasion. On the night before departure, Allen walked among the sleeping rows of soldiers. He paused at each company, listening to snores and murmured dreams, and thought about what he had built. These weren't raw recruits anymore. They were hardened veterans, the core of America's fighting spirit. Whatever waited across the sea, he would face it with them. The Mediterranean shimmered under moonlight as the fleet approached Gela in July 1943. Allen stood on deck, wind tearing at his jacket, eyes fixed on the distant coastline. He had fought across one desert already. Now he was heading into another kind of fire. For him, the war had never been about glory. It was about men. Ordinary Americans shaped into something extraordinary by hardship and courage. And as dawn began to break over the Sicilian shore, Terry Allen knew the real test of his command was still ahead. The dawn over Sicily was stained with smoke before the first soldiers even reached the beach. Landing craft slammed against the shore, ramps dropped, and men waded into chest-deep water under fire. Machine guns crackled from pillboxes hidden in the dunes, and German artillery began to find its range. The air filled with dust, sand, and the sharp hiss of bullets cutting past. Terry Allen was among the first ashore, his uniform soaked, shouting over the chaos, rallying his men forward. To him, leading from the front wasn't bravado, it was the only way he knew to fight. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 tested every lesson Allen had learned in North Africa. The beaches at Gela were chaos, equipment lost in surf, communications broken, units scattered. But Allen's Big Red One was unshakable. He moved through the confusion like a conductor holding together a collapsing orchestra. He directed artillery by radio until batteries were knocked out, then sent runners when radios died. When German tanks broke through the first line, Allen called in naval fire so close that sailors aboard destroyers could see American helmets through binoculars. The battle raged all day. German panzers clawed at the beachhead, their treads grinding over the sand, but the 1st Infantry Division held. At dusk, the line was intact. The Germans pulled back, leaving burning armor and twisted wreckage behind. Reporters later described it as one of the fiercest landings of the war, and at its center, always visible amid gunfire and dust, was Terry Allen. After Gela, the division pushed inland toward the hills. Sicily was nothing like the open desert. Its narrow roads, rocky ridges, and stone villages turned every advance into a bloody slog. The Germans fought with cunning, retreating only to strike again from higher ground. Allen adapted fast. He ordered night movements, flanking attacks through terrain others thought impassable, and relentless pursuit that gave the enemy no time to regroup. His men learned to move with instinct, guided more by the man beside them than by maps. At Troina, one of the highest points in central Sicily, the fighting reached its brutal peak. For 6 days, the Germans launched counterattack after counterattack. The sound of artillery never stopped. The air reeked of cordite and burned grain. Allen's soldiers fought from foxholes that filled with dust instead of mud, and medics worked until their hands were raw. The division lost hundreds of men but never yielded an inch. When the battle finally ended, Troina was rubble and the German line was broken. The road to Messina lay open. But victory brought little rest, and for Allen it carried a cost that no battlefield wound could equal. Word had spread through high command that his informal style, his deep attachment to the enlisted men, and his relaxed discipline were dangerous to the Army's image. Eisenhower's headquarters wanted polished officers who could model professionalism. Allen, with his unpressed uniform and mud-streaked Jeep, didn't fit the picture. 2 days before Time magazine printed his portrait as one of America's finest battlefield leaders, a message arrived at his headquarters. Effective immediately, he was relieved of command. Omar Bradley, his direct superior, delivered the order personally. There was no ceremony, no speech, just a quiet conversation inside a tent where the desert light filtered through canvas walls. Allen didn't argue. He didn't beg. He had seen enough of the Army's politics to know that once a decision came down from above, fighting it only hurt the men left behind. He gathered his staff, lit a cigarette, and told them to carry on. When the division formed up to say goodbye, hundreds of soldiers stood silent. Some wept openly. Others saluted, something they rarely did around him because this time it wasn't about regulations, it was respect. He told them only one thing. The division is bigger than any one man. Keep fighting and keep winning. Then he walked away. For many officers, such an ending would have meant obscurity, but Terry Allen's war wasn't over. The Army still needed men who could turn raw recruits into fighters. In 1944, he was given command of a new unit, the 104th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Timberwolves. They were green, inexperienced, and far from the battlefields of Europe. Allen saw in them a chance to prove himself once more. Training began in Oregon and later at Camp Carson in Colorado. The air was thin, the terrain rough, and Allen made the most of it. He introduced something radical for American troops, night training as a central doctrine. He believed darkness was an ally, not an obstacle. If you can fight at night, he told them, you own the battlefield. Under moonlight, his men marched, fired, and maneuvered until moving through the dark felt as natural as daylight. Allen's methods shocked visiting officers. He reduced formal inspections, replaced drill sergeants' barked orders with combat exercises, and taught his men how to think like their enemy. Every mistake became a lesson, every exhaustion preparation. When he wasn't satisfied, he made them repeat an entire exercise from the beginning, no matter how late the hour. By the time the Timberwolves finished training, they were lean, fast, and unshakably confident. In August 1944, Allen and his division crossed the Atlantic. France was already liberated, but the war in Europe was far from over. The Germans were regrouping along the Siegfried Line, a fortress belt of bunkers, trenches, and dragon's teeth stretching along their border. The Timberwolves' task was to breach it. They entered combat in late September near the Belgian frontier. The weather was cruel. Rain that never stopped, fog thick enough to swallow men whole, and mud that clung to boots like chains. Yet Allen's division moved steadily forward, using the tactics he'd drilled into them. They attacked by night, slipping through shadows while the enemy slept. Cutting wire and overrunning outposts before alarms could sound, Germans began calling them the Night Wolves. Allen was everywhere again. His jeep, marked only with a small 104th stencil, appeared at the front line when least expected. He carried no bodyguards. He preferred to travel with just his driver and a map case. When shells landed close, he didn't flinch. When his men were pinned down, he climbed into foxholes beside them and helped spot targets. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept. To the Timberwolves, he was more than a commander. He was proof that courage didn't wear rank. In November, the 104th fought through the dense woods near Stolberg, then advanced into the outskirts of Cologne. The city was a ruin of shattered buildings and collapsed bridges, but the Germans defended every street corner. House by house, room by room, Allen's men cleared the way. He coordinated tanks, engineers, and infantry in perfect rhythm, using radio calls that were more instinct than script. His experience from North Africa and Sicily showed in every move. Keep momentum. Never stop. Strike faster than the enemy can think. By winter, they had reached the banks of the Rhine. Snow fell over the wreckage of Germany. Fires burned in chimneys of houses without roofs. In the freezing nights, Allen walked among his troops, wrapped in a greatcoat, his breath clouding in the air. He spoke little, just checked positions, shared cigarettes, and moved on. He was 56 years old now, an age when most generals stayed behind the lines. But for Allen, the front was the only place that ever made sense. When the Allies launched their push into the heart of Germany in early 1945, the Timberwolves were among the spearheads. They crossed the Rhine near Cologne, then advanced toward the Ruhr, cutting through resistance that fought with the desperation of a dying empire. The Germans who once mocked the Americans as amateurs now called them unstoppable. And among them, the name that kept resurfacing in captured reports was the same one that had haunted them in North Africa, Terry Allen. In April, the 104th linked up with Soviet forces near the Elbe River. The war in Europe was effectively over. Allen's men had fought for 195 consecutive days without being pushed back from a single objective. Their casualty rates were among the lowest of any frontline division, a testament to their training, discipline, and the man who led them. When the guns finally fell silent, Allen gathered his officers in a bombed-out farmhouse. He didn't make a speech about glory or victory. He simply said, "You did your job. You brought them home." Then he turned away, his face unreadable, and lit another cigarette. After the war, Allen faded quietly from public life. He never wrote a memoir, never sought attention. He spent time with his family, rode horses, and occasionally lectured young officers about the realities of combat. Those who met him were struck by his humility. There was no trace of arrogance, no bitterness about being relieved of command, only the calm satisfaction of a man who had seen the worst and still believed in the men who faced it with him. Among the veterans of the 1st and 104th Divisions, his legend never dimmed. They told stories of the general who refused to hide, who would curse at a colonel one moment and share coffee with a private the next. To them, he was not the perfect soldier the manuals described. He was better. He was human. Terry Allen's philosophy of leadership left a permanent mark on the U.S. Army. He proved that trust and initiative could be more powerful than fear and regulation. His emphasis on training under real conditions, on understanding soldiers as men rather than numbers, shaped generations of commanders who came after him. The modern concept of mission command, the belief that subordinates should be trusted to act independently, can trace its roots to the dusty trails where Allen first told his men, "If you're lost, head toward the gunfire," when he died in Wernde. When he died in 1969, few outside military circles noticed. But in the barracks of Fort Riley, at reunions of the Big Red One and the Timberwolves, his name was spoken with reverence. Old soldiers raised their glasses to the memory of the man who had led them through hell and back. He had never been one for ceremony. No grand parades marked his passing, no polished eulogies from politicians. Yet in the hearts of those who had followed him, Terry de la Mesa Allen remained what he had always been, a fighter, a leader, a soldier's general. If you walked through the cemeteries of North Africa or Belgium, you'd find his legacy written not in marble, but in the stories told beside those graves. The stories of men who lived because their general taught them how to fight, how to think, and how to never give up, no matter the odds. Somewhere in the endless silence that follows war, the echo of his gravelly voice still lingers. The desert winds that once carried the smell of smoke and victory now whisper his name in the dunes. And for those who remember, the legend of Terrible Terry Allen is not a tale of anger or rebellion. It is a reminder that true leadership is born not in orders, but in courage shared equally among men. He was the kind of commander soldiers dreamed of serving under and generals feared to command beside. He broke rules, defied expectations, and in doing so, taught the U.S. Army what victory really required. Not perfection, not polish, just men who believed in their leader and a leader who never stopped believing in them. That was Terry Allen's war. That was his truth. And long after the smoke cleared from the battlefields of North Africa, Sicily, and the forests of Germany, the legend of Terrible Terry lived on. In every soldier who learned that courage, loyalty, and humanity were not weaknesses, but the very weapons that win wars.